Welcome back, survivors. Today's confession comes from deep in the Caribbean wasteland, where crystal waters hide dark secrets. Before the bombs fell, the wealthiest industrialists and politicians built something Vault-Tec never wanted you to know about. Private island bunkers scattered across the Caribbean where the elite could ride out the apocalypse in luxury while the world burned. Let's descend into the forgotten history of the Caribbean island vaults and discover what really happened when paradise became a prison. They never told us about the island vaults, not in any Vault-Tec promotional material, not in any government record, not even in the Enclave's encrypted files I found rotting in that bunker off the Florida Keys. But I was there. I saw what they built. I know what happened when the bombs fell and the real America showed its face. My name is Marcus Thorne, and I used to be a maintenance technician for Vault-Tec's Special Projects Division. That's what they called it on paper. Special Projects. Sounds clean, doesn't it? Official. But what it really meant was this. We built the vaults they didn't want anyone to know about. The ones that weren't part of the official 122. The ones where the real power players of pre-war America bought their way into paradise while the rest of the country burned. I'm recording this on a salvaged holotape because someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand what really happened in those tropical fortresses scattered across the Caribbean. Someone needs to know about the empires that rose from the ashes of those forgotten bunkers. It started in 2073, 4 years before the Great War. I was 26 years old, fresh out of Vault-Tec University with a degree in environmental systems engineering. They recruited me straight from graduation. Good pay, they said. Prestigious work. Top secret clearance. I thought I'd won the lottery. I had no idea I'd just signed my soul over to the devil. The first time I heard about the Caribbean Initiative was in a basement office in Vault-Tec's Los Angeles headquarters. My supervisor, a man named Gerald Chambers, slid a manila folder across his desk. Inside were blueprints unlike anything I'd seen in my coursework. These weren't the standard vault designs. These were custom, luxurious, obscenely expensive. Chambers leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette. The smoke curled around the fluorescent lights above us. He said the Caribbean Initiative was Vault-Tec's most profitable venture, private contracts with what he called persons of significant economic and political importance. Translation? The ultra-rich wanted their own personal apocalypse hotels. Each island vault was custom designed for its owner. Some were built for single families. Others housed small groups of business partners or political allies. The contracts ranged from $50 million to over $300 million for the most elaborate installations. Chambers showed me schematics for one vault on a private island near Puerto Rico that included an indoor tropical garden, a cinema, a wine cellar stocked with pre-war vintages, and living quarters that looked more like a 5-star resort than a survival bunker. I asked Chambers why these vaults weren't part of the official societal preservation program. Why hide them? He took a long drag from his cigarette and said something I'll never forget. He said that Project Safe House was theater, a puppet show for the masses. The real survival plan was always reserved for people who could afford it. The Caribbean was perfect for this scheme. Dozens of uninhabited islands, warm climate, far enough from major population centers to avoid direct nuclear strikes, close enough to old shipping routes for supply deliveries, and most importantly, completely off the grid. No nosy reporters, no government oversight beyond the Enclave members who were already in on the deal, just crystal blue water, white sand beaches, and underground palaces for the privileged few. My first assignment was a vault on an island called Cayo Esmeralda, about 90 miles northeast of Cuba. The client was a man named Jonathan Ashford, CEO of Ashford Petrochemical Industries. Ashford had purchased the entire island in 2068 for $12 million. By the time we started construction in 2074, he'd already spent another $80 million on the vault itself. I spent 8 months on Cayo Esmeralda. The island was small, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide. Dense jungle vegetation, beautiful beaches, a small dock on the southern shore where supply boats arrived twice a month. During construction, we had a crew of about 40 people living in prefab barracks. Vault-Tec flew us in on private aircraft and swore us all to secrecy with non-disclosure agreements that threatened criminal prosecution. The vault entrance was hidden beneath a fake maintenance shed near the center of the island. Standard Vault-Tec gear door, but upgraded, thicker, heavier, more radiation shielding. The interior was like something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. The main living area featured marble floors imported from Italy. The walls were paneled in mahogany. Ashford's personal suite had a California king bed, a private bathroom with a jacuzzi, and a study filled with first edition books. There was a full commercial kitchen, a dining room that could seat 20, a gym, a medical bay that would make most hospitals jealous, and a hydroponic garden designed to produce fresh vegetables indefinitely. But here's the thing that made my stomach turn. The vault was designed for exactly 12 people. Ashford, his wife, his 2 children, and 8 hand-picked employees. That's it. $80 million for 12 people, while Vault-Tec's public vaults were cramming 1,000 people into spaces designed for 800. I met Ashford twice during construction. He flew in on his private helicopter to inspect the work. Tall guy, silver hair, expensive suit even in the Caribbean heat. He walked through that vault like he was touring a luxury hotel, made comments about the granite countertops, asked if we could install a better sound system in the entertainment room, didn't seem to grasp that the world might be ending and he was building a fortress while millions of Americans were being sold lottery tickets for vault spaces that would never save them. The second time I met him, he brought his family. His wife stayed on the helicopter, didn't even want to see the vault. But his son, a kid maybe 17 years old, he followed Ashford around taking notes. I remember the kid asking his father if they'd selected the 8 employees yet. Ashford laughed. He actually laughed. He said he'd probably wait until the last minute to decide, keep people motivated, keep them competing for the privilege of survival. That's when I realized these island vaults weren't just about safety, they were about power. Absolute power, the ability to choose who lived and who died, the ability to build a new world according to your own rules. These weren't survival bunkers, they were kingdoms waiting to be born. Over the next 3 years, I worked on 6 more island vaults, each one more elaborate than the last. A vault near the Bahamas for a media mogul who installed a fully functional radio station to broadcast to whatever remained after the bombs. A vault in the Virgin Islands for a retired 4-star general who converted the entire facility into a military command center with enough weapons to outfit a small army. A vault off the coast of Jamaica for a pharmaceutical executive who'd stockpiled every drug imaginable, legal and otherwise, but the one that haunted me most was Vault 37 Echo. That wasn't its official designation. It didn't have one. It was just called Echo by everyone who worked on it. Built on a remote island called Isla Sangre, about 200 miles east of Puerto Rico, the client was a group of 7 wealthy industrialists who'd pooled their resources. $250 million, the most expensive private vault ever constructed. Echo was massive, 3 levels, designed for 40 permanent residents plus a rotating staff of 20. The industrialists had big plans. They wanted to preserve pre-war technology, maintain their wealth and influence, position themselves to control whatever emerged from the ashes. They installed a fabrication facility that could manufacture weapons, tools, and electronics. They stockpiled raw materials. They even brought in scientists and engineers, promising them vault space in exchange for their expertise. I spent a year at Isla Sangre. The island was larger than Cayo Esmeralda, maybe 6 miles long. Rocky cliffs on the northern shore, dense rainforest inland. The vault entrance was hidden inside a cave system that had been expanded and reinforced with concrete. Getting in required navigating a 1/4 mile of tunnels. Perfect defensive position. The 7 industrialists visited regularly during construction. I learned their names: Alexander Horn, defense contractor; Patricia Vega, tech mogul; Richard Moss, banking executive; Sandra Chen, pharmaceutical CEO, James Caldwell, oil magnate, Maria Santos, real estate developer, and the group's unofficial leader, a man named Victor Blackwood, who'd made his fortune in rare earth mineral extraction. Blackwood was different from Ashford, colder, more calculating. He understood what was coming. He knew the Great War was inevitable. He talked about it openly, called it the Great Reset. He said the old world order was corrupt and inefficient, said what was coming would wipe the slate clean, give humanity a chance to start over, with the right people in charge, of course, people like him and his partners. The staff quarters at Echo were comfortable but not luxurious. The message was clear. The industrialists were royalty. Everyone else was there to serve. During my time on the island, I watched them test their authority, giving orders, making demands, treating the workers like property they'd purchased along with their vault space. I remember one incident that crystallized everything for me. One of the scientists, a woman named Dr. Sarah Mitchell, questioned one of the industrialists' decisions. Something about the water recycling system. She was right, technically, but Blackwood didn't care about being right. He cared about being obeyed. He had her removed from the project, flew her back to the mainland that same day. No discussion, no appeal, just gone. That's when I understood the real experiment happening in these island vaults. It wasn't about survival. It wasn't about preserving humanity. It was about creating a new aristocracy. A ruling class that would emerge from the apocalypse with all the advantages, the knowledge, the resources, the organization, while everyone else fought over scraps in the radioactive ruins. These people would be living in comfort, planning their return to power. By 2076, most of the Caribbean vaults were complete. Vault-Tec's Special Projects Division started winding down operations. They paid us well, gave us bonuses, made us sign additional non-disclosure agreements. Most of my coworkers took their money and disappeared into quiet civilian lives, but I couldn't let it go. I'd seen too much, knew too much. I started keeping records, copying files, smuggling documents. I told myself I'd expose the whole operation, blow the whistle, let the world know that while Vault-Tec was selling the public a lie about equal chances of survival, the real plan was to save only the wealthy and powerful. But who would I tell? The government? They were in on it. The Enclave was basically running the whole show. The media? Most of them were owned by the same people building these island vaults. Then, October 23rd, 2077 arrived, the day the world ended. The day everything I'd worried about became irrelevant. I was in Miami when the bombs fell, working a consulting job for Vault-Tec, helping retrofit an older vault with new environmental systems. I saw the flash on the horizon, felt the ground shake, heard the sirens. Like everyone else, I ran. Unlike most people, I knew exactly where to go. There was an old Vault-Tec supply depot on the outskirts of Miami, not a real vault, just a reinforced warehouse where we stored equipment and materials. But it had thick walls, a basement, emergency supplies. I made it there with about 30 other people. We sealed the doors and waited. 3 weeks. That's how long we stayed underground. When we finally emerged, Miami was gone. Just rubble and ash. The sky was the color of rust. The air tasted like metal and death. Most of the people I'd sheltered with wandered off, looking for family or friends or some reason to keep living. I went south, toward the Florida Keys, toward the islands. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. It took me 3 months to reach the Keys, 3 months of walking through a dead world. The radiation levels were lower than I expected this far south, but the devastation was complete. Small towns reduced to shadows on cracked pavement, bodies that had been people once, now just twisted silhouettes fused to walls and streets. The silence was worst. No birds, no insects, just wind whistling through empty buildings. I survived by scavenging, found a Geiger counter in an abandoned civil defense station, learned to avoid the hot zones, learned which water sources were clean enough to drink, learned that the world had been divided into 2 categories, the living and the soon-to-be dead. I was determined to stay in the first category. The Florida Keys had been hit, but not directly. Most of the damage came from the shockwaves and firestorms that spread south from Miami. Key Largo was a burnt-out shell. Islamorada was underwater. The storm surged from the blasts having reshaped the coastline. But by the time I reached Marathon, I started seeing survivors. Small groups, scared, desperate, already forming the tribes and gangs that would define the wasteland. I avoided them. I had a destination, a purpose. I needed to know what had happened to the island vaults. Had they survived? Were the wealthy industrialists sitting in their underground palaces waiting for the radiation to clear? Or had something gone wrong? I found a boat in Marathon, small fishing vessel that had been blown inland by the surge but was still intact. Took me 2 weeks to repair it enough to be seaworthy, another week to scavenge enough fuel. Then I set out into the Caribbean, heading for the closest island vault I knew, Cayo Esmeralda, Jonathan Ashford's personal paradise. The journey should have taken 6 hours. It took 3 days. Ocean was different now. Strange currents, debris fields that stretched for miles. Twice I saw things moving in the water, large things. I didn't stop to investigate. By the time I spotted Cayo Esmeralda on the horizon, I was sunburned, dehydrated, and half convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. The island looked intact from a distance. The jungle canopy was brown and dying but still standing. The beaches were littered with debris, but recognizable. I anchored offshore and swam to the beach, my salvaged hunting rifle wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. The silence was profound. No waves, no wind, just the sound of my breathing. I found the fake maintenance shed exactly where we'd built it. The door was sealed. The Vault-Tec logo was still visible on the metal surface, though rust had begun its work. I tried the external controls. Dead, no power. That meant either the reactor had failed or someone had shut it down from inside. Neither option was good. It took me 4 hours to bypass the external locks using tools I'd brought from the supply depot. When the massive gear door finally ground open, the smell hit me immediately. Death, decay. Something had gone very wrong inside Jonathan Ashford's $80 million paradise. The interior lights were off. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating scenes of destruction. The marble floors were cracked. The mahogany panels were warped and moldy. Water had leaked in from somewhere, flooding the lower sections. But it wasn't the physical damage that made my blood run cold. It was the bodies. 12 people had entered this vault. I found 14 bodies. That math didn't make sense until I examined them more closely. 2 of the bodies were wearing vault suits. Standard Vault-Tec issue, not the custom-tailored ones I'd seen Ashford's family wearing. Someone had let in refugees after the bombs fell, or tried to. The 2 bodies in vault suits were near the entrance, bullet wounds in their backs. They'd been shot trying to get in, or maybe trying to get out. I found Ashford in his personal suite. He'd been dead for months, maybe years, hard to tell in the tropical heat, but the bullet wound in his skull was clear enough. The gun was still in his hand. Suicide. On his desk was a handwritten note. The paper was water damaged, but I could make out most of it. They wouldn't stop screaming. Every day, every night, begging to be let in. I thought I could ignore it. I thought I was strong enough. But Margaret couldn't take it. She opened the door, tried to let them in. I had to stop her, had to protect what we'd built. Now they're all dead anyway. The radiation, the disease, the fighting, all dead. We chose 12, just 12, left thousands to die. And for what? This tomb, this expensive coffin, I can hear them still, scratching at the door, screaming my name. I'm sorry. God forgive me. I'm sorry. I found Margaret Ashford in the medical bay. She'd been shot 3 times in the chest. Ashford's son and daughter were in their rooms. Looked like they'd died from radiation sickness. Must have been exposed when Margaret opened the door. The 8 employees were scattered throughout the vault, some dead from radiation, others from violence. One man looked like he'd been beaten to death with a pipe wrench. Cayo Esmeralda had been hell. a pressure cooker of guilt, fear, and desperation. Ashford had built his kingdom and discovered too late that being king of the dead isn't worth much. I left that island vault feeling sick, feeling angry, but also curious. If this was what happened at Cayo Esmeralda, what had become of the other island vaults? Over the next 2 years, I visited 7 more Caribbean island vaults. Each one told a different story of collapse and failure. The media mogul's vault near the Bahamas was empty, completely abandoned. The radio equipment was smashed. The supplies were gone, signs of a hasty evacuation. I never found out where they went. The retired general's vault in the Virgin Islands had become a fortress. The survivors had sealed themselves in and refused to open the door for anyone. I tried making contact, shouted through the external speaker system. Someone finally responded. A man's voice, hard and cold. He said they didn't need anyone from the outside, said they were self-sufficient, said if I didn't leave, they'd activate the external defense systems. I believed him and left. The pharmaceutical executive's vault off Jamaica was the most disturbing. I found evidence of extensive drug experimentation, not on the zombies or ghouls wandering the wasteland, on the vault residents themselves. Looked like the executive had gone mad, started testing his stockpile on the people trapped inside with him. Bodies showed signs of mutation, aggressive tumors, neurological damage. One entire room was filled with what looked like failed cloning experiments, tanks full of malformed flesh. I didn't stay long. But Vault 37 Echo, Victor Blackwood's massive installation on Isla Sangre, that was different. That was where everything changed, where the real story began. I reached Isla Sangre in November of 2079, 2 years after the bombs fell. The island was more intact than the others I'd visited. The rainforest was struggling but alive, mutated. The trees had grown strange bark that looked almost metallic. The undergrowth glowed faintly at night, but life had adapted, survived, even thrived in its twisted new forms. The cave entrance to Echo was sealed, but not locked. Someone had disabled the security systems. I descended through the tunnels, my footsteps echoing off stone walls. The deeper I went, the more I heard. Voices, machinery, life. Echo was functional, not just functional, thriving. The lights were on. The air filtration was running. I could hear the hum of the fusion reactor deep below. Someone had kept this place alive. Someone had succeeded where Ashford and the others had failed. I was stopped by guards before I reached the main vault door. 4 men in makeshift armor carrying military-grade weapons, Vault-Tec security rifles, laser pistols. They demanded to know who I was, what I wanted. I told them the truth, my name, my history with Vault-Tec, my role in building Echo. They conferred quietly, then one of them spoke into a radio. 5 minutes later, they escorted me inside. The interior of Echo was transformed. The luxury quarters of the 7 industrialists had been converted into a command center. Maps covered the walls, maps of the Caribbean, maps of Florida, maps of Central America. Red pins marked locations, blue pins marked others, green pins marked what looked like trade routes. This wasn't just a vault anymore. It was the center of something larger. Victor Blackwood was still alive, still in charge. He looked older, harder. His silver hair had gone white. His face was lined with scars, but his eyes still held that calculating intelligence I remembered. He greeted me like an old friend, asked about my journey, offered me food and water, then he showed me what they'd built. In the 2 years since the bombs fell, Blackwood and his partners had established an empire. They'd sent expeditions to the other island vaults, salvaged what they could, recruited survivors, established trade networks with settlements along the coasts. They'd positioned themselves exactly as they'd planned, as the new ruling class of the Caribbean wasteland. Blackwood explained his vision over dinner that first night. The old world was gone. The old rules were irrelevant. What mattered now was survival, organization, and control. Echo had all 3. They had technology, they had resources, they had knowledge, they could offer protection, medicine, clean water. In exchange, they expected loyalty, obedience, tribute. He called it the Caribbean Coalition. 7 island vaults had survived to form the core. Echo was the capital. The other vaults handled specialized functions: manufacturing, agriculture, research, military operations. They'd even established contact with some enclave remnants, though Blackwood was careful about that relationship. He didn't want to be anyone's subordinate. I asked him about the people outside the coalition, the wastelanders, the refugees, the survivors barely clinging to life in the ruins. Blackwood's expression didn't change. He said the same thing I'd heard him say before the war: the Great Reset. The strong would survive, the weak would perish. That was nature, that was necessity. The coalition would help those who could be useful. The rest didn't matter. I stayed at Echo for 3 months, watched the coalition grow, watched trading caravans arrive from settlements across the Caribbean, watched Blackwood's influence spread like radiation. The man had built exactly what he'd wanted: a kingdom, his kingdom, and no one had the power to stop him. But I also saw the cracks, the resentment among the lower-tier workers, the fear in the eyes of the tribals who brought tribute, the way Blackwood's partners looked at him when they thought he wasn't watching. This empire was built on sand, on lies, on the same greed and power hunger that had destroyed the old world. It wouldn't last, couldn't last. One night, I broke into Echo's data archives, downloaded everything I could onto holotapes: names, locations, trade routes, military assets, everything. Then I stole a boat and left before sunrise. Some of Blackwood's people saw me leaving. They might have tried to stop me, but I'd helped build Echo. I knew the security systems, knew how to bypass them. I've spent the last 5 years moving between settlements, documenting what I've learned. The Caribbean Coalition still exists, but it's changed. Blackwood died in 2081, killed during a raid by raiders from Cuba. His partners fought over control. The coalition fractured. Some vaults remain allied. Others went independent. A few were destroyed in the fighting. But the legacy remains. Those island vaults created a new ruling class just as they were designed to. Not the industrialists themselves. Most of them are dead now, but their children, their chosen successors. They inherited the technology, the resources, the knowledge. They're building new settlements, new trade empires, new kingdoms in the wasteland. And here's what keeps me awake at night. What if this was always the plan, not just for the Caribbean, but everywhere? What if Vault-Tec and the Enclave designed the entire system to create a new aristocracy? The public vaults were experiments, yes, but maybe the real purpose was to create chaos, to thin the population, to ensure only the right people survive to rebuild civilization. The wealthy industrialists bought their survival. They bought their children's future. They bought the right to rule whatever emerged from the ashes. And we helped them, people like me. We built their palaces. We sealed their doors. We gave them the keys to the kingdom while the rest of humanity burned. If this story has kept you listening this far and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. I don't know if anyone will hear this recording. I don't know if it matters anymore. But someone needed to know the truth. Someone needed to understand where these new powers came from. Someone needed to remember that the empires rising from the Caribbean weren't built on courage or ingenuity or survival instinct. They were bought, purchased with blood money while the world died screaming. The Caribbean Coalition might have fractured, but its influence spread like a plague. By 2082, I tracked at least 15 independent settlements that trace their origins back to the island vaults, each one controlled by descendants or chosen successors of the original industrialists, each one hoarding pre-war technology like dragon's gold, each one demanding tribute from the desperate wastelanders who needed their medicine, their clean water, their protection. I want to tell you about 3 of these settlements specifically. 3 kingdoms built on the bones of the island vault system. 3 examples of what happens when you give absolute power to people who think wealth equals worth. The first was Nueva Paraíso, built on the ruins of San Juan, Puerto Rico. The vault that became its foundation had belonged to Patricia Vega, the tech mogul I mentioned earlier. Vega had died in 2079 during a ghoul attack on one of her supply runs, but her daughter, Isabella Vega, inherited control of the vault and everything in it, including the fabrication facility that could manufacture functioning computer systems, communication equipment, and most importantly, weapons. Isabella was 22 when the bombs fell, spent her formative years watching her mother build a trading empire from their island vault, learned everything about manipulation, control, and the value of monopoly. By the time I reached Nueva Paraíso in 2083, Isabella had transformed the settlement into a technological fortress, high walls, guard towers, automated turrets powered by fusion cells. The place looked more advanced than anything I'd seen in the pre-war world, but the cost of that advancement was brutal. Isabella controlled the only functioning fabrication facility in the Eastern Caribbean. If you wanted weapons, you came to Nueva Paraíso. If you wanted communication equipment, you came to Isabella. If you wanted medical diagnostic tools, you paid her price, and her price was always high. Food, salvage, labor, sometimes people. I met a man there named Carlos Rodriguez, former fisherman from one of the coastal settlements. His daughter had radiation sickness, the kind that kills slowly, painfully. Isabella's doctors had the medicine that could save her. Carlos couldn't afford it. So he sold himself, signed a contract making him property of Nueva Paraíso for 10 years, slave labor in exchange for his daughter's life. I asked Carlos if his daughter survived. He wouldn't look at me, just shook his head. She died 3 weeks after he signed the contract. The medicine had been defective, old pre-war stock that had degraded past effectiveness. Isabella knew. Her doctors knew. They'd sold it anyway. Carlos was trapped. His contract was legally binding by Nueva Paraíso law. He had 8 more years of servitude for a daughter who died anyway. Isabella Vega had turned her mother's vault into a machine that consumed the desperate and produced wealth. She justified it the same way her mother had, the same way Blackwood had. Survival of the fittest, the strong prosper, the weak serve or die. She believed it completely, had been raised to believe it. The island vaults hadn't just saved the wealthy elite, they'd preserved their ideology, their value system, their casual cruelty toward anyone they considered beneath them. The second settlement was Merchants Haven, located on what used to be a private island near the Turks and Caicos. The vault there had belonged to Richard Moss, the banking executive. Moss himself had died during the early years, killed by one of his own guards during a dispute over food rationing. But his financial systems survived, his records, his understanding of debt and leverage. The people who inherited Merchants Haven weren't Moss's family. They were his former employees, accountants and traders who'd earned their vault spots by being useful. They understood something crucial that most wastelanders didn't. In a world without money, debt becomes even more powerful. Merchants Haven operated as a bank. They loaned supplies, medicine, equipment, anything a struggling settlement might need. The interest rates were reasonable, almost generous, but the terms were ironclad. Miss a payment and Merchants Haven sent collectors, armed collectors. They took what they were owed, plus penalties. Couldn't pay? They took people, sent them to work in the salvage operations until the debt was cleared. The genius of it was that most settlements could never clear their debts. The interest accumulated faster than they could pay, so they remained permanently indebted to Merchants Haven, permanently obligated, permanently controlled. It was slavery with paperwork, exploitation dressed up as legitimate business. I spent 2 weeks at Merchants Haven documenting their operation. Met a woman named Anna Torres who ran their collections department. She'd been a junior accountant before the war. Now she commanded a force of 50 armed debt collectors and controlled the economic fate of 30 settlements. She was 30 years old. Anna showed me their records with obvious pride, explained how they'd adapted pre-war financial instruments to the wasteland economy, futures contracts on salvage yields, bonds backed by settlement production, insurance policies against raider attacks. They'd recreated the entire banking system in miniature, complete with all its predatory mechanisms. I asked Anna if she ever felt guilty, if she ever thought about the people whose lives were destroyed by unpayable debts. She looked at me like I'd asked if she felt guilty about gravity. "This was just how the world worked," she said. "Resources flow to those who manage them best. Capital accumulates where it's most efficiently utilized." She used those exact words, like she was reading from a pre-war economics textbook. The third settlement was the most terrifying. Port Blackwater, built on a heavily fortified island that had once housed the vault of James Caldwell, the oil magnate. Caldwell had survived the initial chaos and died of old age in 2085. His son, Marcus Caldwell, inherited not just the vault, but his father's vision of order through strength. Marcus had converted his father's luxury vault into a military academy. He'd recruited Wastelander children, orphans mostly, and trained them from age 6 or 7 to be soldiers. Perfect soldiers, loyal, disciplined, utterly devoted to Port Blackwater and the Caldwell family. By 2086, Marcus commanded a force of over 300 trained fighters, the most professional military force in the Caribbean wasteland. Port Blackwater sold protection. Any settlement could hire their services. For the right price, Port Blackwater soldiers would defend your walls, train your militia, eliminate raider threats. They were effective, ruthlessly so. A settlement that hired Port Blackwater was almost guaranteed survival, but you could never stop paying. Once you brought in Caldwell soldiers, removing them was suicide. They knew your defenses, your weaknesses, your secrets. You were protected, yes, but you were also occupied. I met Marcus Caldwell in 2087. He was 43 years old, military bearing despite never having served in the pre-war armed forces. He walked me through Port Blackwater's training facilities, showed me children practicing small arms drills, teenagers learning tactical maneuvers, young adults who could strip a laser rifle blindfolded. Marcus believed he was saving civilization, building the foundation for a new society based on law and order. He didn't see the irony, didn't understand that he'd created a system where peace required permanent military presence, where security meant surrender. His soldiers weren't protectors, they were occupiers, and settlements that tried to terminate their contracts learned quickly what happened when you crossed Marcus Caldwell. I documented one such case. A coastal settlement called Esperanza had hired Port Blackwater protection for 3 years. When they tried to end the contract, citing inability to pay, Marcus offered them revised terms, doubled rates. Esperanza refused. Within 2 weeks, raiders attacked the settlement. Heavy weaponry, coordinated assault, professional tactics. Esperanza's elder council suspected Port Blackwater had orchestrated the attack. No way to prove it, of course, but after the raiders withdrew, Marcus offered protection again. Same doubled rates. Esperanza signed. They had no choice. These 3 settlements, Nueva, Paraíso, Merchants Haven, and Port Blackwater, they represented the 3 pillars of the new Caribbean order: technology, finance, military force, all descended from the island vaults, all controlled by people who'd inherited not just resources but ideology, the belief that some humans are worth more than others, that wealth and power justify themselves, that the strong have the right to rule the weak. But here's what the industrialists and their successors never understood, what Blackwood and Isabella Vega and Marcus Caldwell never grasped. Empires built on exploitation always collapse, always, because you can't build a stable civilization on the suffering of the majority. You can't maintain control when most people have nothing left to lose. The resistance started in 2088, small at first, a settlement that refused to pay Nueva Paraíso's equipment prices, a debtor who killed a Merchants Haven collector and fled into the wasteland, a town that drove out Port Blackwater's garrison during the night. Individual acts of defiance, desperation, but desperation spreads. I was on the island of Hispaniola when the real rebellion began. A woman named Rosa Martinez, former slave to one of the Vault settlements, had escaped and started organizing. Not a military resistance, something smarter, a trade network that bypassed the Vault settlements entirely. Direct exchange between independent communities. No middlemen, no tribute, no debts. Rosa understood what the Vault settlements feared most. Not violence, not raiders, but irrelevance. If Wastelander communities could survive without Nueva Paraíso's technology, without Merchants Haven's loans, without Port Blackwater's protection, then the entire system collapsed. The empires built by the island vaults only had power because people needed what they controlled. Rosa's network started small, 5 settlements, then 10, then 20. By 2090, over 60 independent communities were trading directly with each other, sharing resources, sharing knowledge, helping each other survive without bowing to the Vault settlements. It wasn't perfect. Resources were scarce, technology was limited, but they were free. That mattered more than comfort. The Vault settlements responded exactly as you'd expect. Nueva Paraíso cut off equipment sales to any settlement in Rosa's network. Merchants Haven called in all outstanding debts immediately, demanding full payment. Port Blackwater launched punitive raids against communities that refused their protection services. The 3 pillars of power tried to crush the resistance through economic and military pressure. It might have worked, probably should have worked. The Vault settlements had advantages in every measurable category: better weapons, better organization, better resources. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed Wastelanders would break under pressure, would come crawling back when things got hard enough, would choose survival over freedom. The Wastelanders chose differently. When Nueva Paraíso cut off equipment sales, settlements learned to repair and maintain their own gear. Jury-rigged solutions, wasteland engineering. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. When Merchants Haven demanded immediate debt repayment, communities defaulted en masse. Can't extract payment from 50 settlements simultaneously. The collection force wasn't large enough. When Port Blackwater launched raids, the settlements fought back together. Coordinated defense, shared intelligence. They lost people, lost supplies, but they didn't surrender. By 2092, the Caribbean Coalition's successor states were in crisis, not military crisis. Economic crisis. Their power structure depended on communities needing them, depending on them. When that dependence broke, their empires started crumbling. Nueva Paraíso still had the best technology, but no one to sell it to. Merchants Haven held debt contracts worth nothing if the debtors refused to acknowledge them. Port Blackwater had soldiers, but no one willing to pay for protection. I watched Isabella Vega's response to the crisis from a distance. She tried negotiation first, offered better terms, lower prices, partnership instead of dominance. But Rosa's network had learned their lesson. You can't partner with someone who sees you as property. The Vault settlements had revealed their nature during the good times. Wastelanders weren't going to trust them now just because circumstances had changed. When negotiation failed, Isabella tried force, sent armed expeditions to seize salvage from independent settlements, take by violence what she could no longer extract through trade. But this wasn't the early days anymore. Wastelander communities had learned to fight, learned to organize, learned that Vault settlement soldiers bled just like everyone else. Isabella's expeditions suffered casualties, heavy casualties. Her own people started questioning whether the empire was worth dying for. Marcus Caldwell tried a different approach, withdrew Port Blackwater forces from most settlements, consolidated his strength on his home island, built up his defenses, tried to wait out the rebellion. He believed Rosa's network would fracture without external pressure, that Wastelanders would turn on each other given time. He was wrong. The network grew stronger. More settlements joined. More trade routes opened. They were building something the Vault settlements had never imagined possible, a civilization without rulers. Merchants Haven collapsed first. In 2094, the settlement's leadership tried to enforce a major debt collection, sent their entire force of collectors to a settlement called Libertad. The collectors never came back. Libertad's militia ambushed them, killed some, captured others, sent a message back to Merchants Haven written in blood. We don't recognize your debts. We don't recognize your authority. Come for us again, and we'll come for you. Without enforcement capability, Merchants Haven's entire economic model failed. Debt contracts became worthless paper. The accountants and traders who'd run the settlement had no other skills, no way to survive without the exploitation system they'd built. Within 6 months, Merchants Haven was abandoned. The people scattered. Some joined Rosa's network. Others fled to the remaining vault settlements. A few tried to establish new operations elsewhere. None succeeded. Nueva Paraíso lasted longer. Isabella Vega was smarter than most of her peers. She recognized that the old system was dying, started making genuine compromises, opened her fabrication facilities to train Wastelander technicians, shared knowledge instead of hoarding it, lowered prices to sustainable levels. For a while, it looked like Nueva Paraíso might transition peacefully into Rosa's network. But ideology dies hard. Isabella's inner circle couldn't accept equality with Wastelanders, couldn't surrender the privileges they'd grown up with. In 2097, hardliners within Nueva Paraíso staged a coup, killed Isabella, tried to restore the old order. The resistance's response was swift and brutal. 3 settlements in Rosa's network launched a coordinated assault on Nueva Paraíso. They breached the walls, captured the fabrication facility, distributed the technology to everyone who'd been denied it for decades. Port Blackwater was the last to fall. Marcus Caldwell had prepared for siege. His island fortress was impregnable by any force the Wastelanders could assemble. He had supplies for years, trained soldiers who'd never known anything but military discipline, automated defenses that could repel any conventional assault. He believed he could outlast the rebellion, wait for Rosa's network to collapse under its own weight, then rebuild the empire his father had envisioned. But Marcus made the same mistake every tyrant makes. He forgot that his soldiers were human, that even perfect discipline has limits, that loyalty based on indoctrination rather than choice is fragile when tested. The end came from within. A young officer named Daniel Reyes, 24 years old, raised in Port Blackwater's military academy since age 7. Daniel had been sent on reconnaissance missions to the independent settlements, had seen how people lived outside the vault system, had talked to people who made their own choices, who weren't slaves to debt or technology or military occupation. Something in him shifted. Daniel started quietly talking to other soldiers, asking questions. What were they fighting for? Who were they protecting? Marcus Caldwell's vision of order or their own freedom? The conversation spread. Doubts multiplied. By 2099, Marcus had a rebellion brewing in his own ranks. The coup happened on October 23rd, 2099, 22 years to the day after the bombs fell. Daniel and 60 other soldiers seized control of Port Blackwater's command center, locked down the automated defenses, demanded Marcus Caldwell surrender, and face trial for crimes against the Wastelander communities. Marcus refused, barricaded himself in the old vault section with his most loyal troops. For 3 days, Port Blackwater tore itself apart in civil war. Soldier fought soldier in the corridors where Marcus's father had once hosted pre-war parties. The fabrication facilities I'd helped build decades ago became battlegrounds. The luxury suites became tombs. Marcus Caldwell died on October 26th, not in battle. He took his own life when it became clear his loyalists couldn't hold, left a final message that I managed to obtain years later. In it, he talked about betrayal, about ingratitude, about how he'd only wanted to bring order to chaos. He never understood, never grasped that order built on oppression isn't order at all. It's just slow-motion violence. With Port Blackwater's fall, the last of the major vault settlements was gone. The Caribbean Coalition's successor states had all collapsed. The empires built on island vault wealth had crumbled. But that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of one chapter. Rosa Martinez's network evolved into something called the Free Caribbean Alliance, not a government exactly, more like a confederation of independent settlements that chose to cooperate. No central authority, no ruling class, just mutual aid and voluntary association. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is, but it was built on fundamentally different principles than the vault settlements. I attended the Alliance's first major gathering in the year 2000. Over 200 settlements sent representatives to an island near Cuba. They met in the ruins of an old resort, sitting on salvaged furniture under a sky that still carried traces of radioactive dust. No one person controlled the meeting. Decisions were made collectively. Resources were shared freely. Knowledge was considered common property. Rosa Martinez spoke at that gathering. She was 48 years old, scarred and weathered by decades in the wasteland. She talked about what they'd accomplished, how communities that the vault settlements had considered worthless, disposable, had built a civilization without masters, without exploitation, without the lie that some people deserve paradise while others deserve ashes. But she also warned them. The ideology that created the island vaults hadn't died with those settlements. It still existed, in scattered groups, in individuals who'd escaped the collapses, in anyone who believed that wealth and power justified themselves, that some humans were worth more than others, that the strong have the right to rule the weak. That ideology would resurface. It always did. The Alliance had to remain vigilant. She was right. I've spent the last 25 years traveling the Caribbean, documenting the aftermath. The vault settlements are gone, but their legacy remains. There are still communities built on exploitation, still people trying to recreate the old hierarchies, still those who dream of becoming the new aristocracy. I found one such group in 2007, a settlement called New Providence on a fortified island near Nassau. The leaders were descendants of vault settlement refugees. They'd learned from their predecessors' mistakes, used softer methods, prettier words. Instead of demanding tribute, they offered partnerships. Instead of enforcing debts, they created dependencies. Instead of occupying settlements, they installed advisors. But the core was the same, the belief that they were better, more capable, more deserving. They saw the Alliance as chaos that needed ordering, saw freedom as inefficiency that needed correction. They were patient, willing to wait, to slowly rebuild the power structures their parents had lost, to create a new empire that would be more subtle, more insidious, more permanent than the crude domination of the early vault settlements. I tried to warn Alliance communities about New Providence, showed them my documentation, explained the patterns I'd seen. Some listened, others didn't want to believe it. They'd fought so hard to break free from the vault settlements. They couldn't accept that the fight wasn't over, that it might never be over, that every generation would have to choose between freedom and domination, between cooperation and exploitation, between seeing others as equals or as resources. There are days I wonder if any of this matters, if anyone will care about these recordings. The Caribbean is just one small part of a devastated world. What happened here with the island vaults, what's happening now with their legacy, it's probably playing out everywhere. Wherever people survived with resources and power, wherever people survived with nothing but each other, these same conflicts are burning. But then I remember something Rosa Martinez said to me personally, shortly before I left the Alliance gathering in 2000. We were sitting on a beach watching the sunset. The sky was still wrong colors from the radiation. The water still carried traces of fallout, but it was beautiful in its own broken way. Rosa told me she didn't know if the Alliance would last, didn't know if humanity would ever truly learn from its mistakes, but she knew that the fight was worth having, that every time people chose cooperation over domination, freedom over control, they pushed the world a little bit towards something better. even if that progress was temporary, even if it had to be fought for again by the next generation. She asked me what I was going to do with all my documentation, all my recordings, all my evidence of what really happened with the island vaults. I told her I didn't know. Who would care about the confessions of an old maintenance technician? Who would want to hear about pre-war corruption and post-war rebellion? Rosa smiled. She said someone would care. Someday. Maybe not today, maybe not for decades, but eventually someone would need to know, would need to understand where these patterns came from, would need evidence that resistance was possible, that empires built on exploitation always fall, that people can build something better if they're willing to fight for it. So I've kept recording, kept documenting. This holotape you're hearing now is part of a collection, dozens of recordings, hundreds of hours, testimony from survivors, evidence of crimes, documentation of resistance, the complete history of the Caribbean island vaults from construction to collapse. I'm old now, 73 years old in a world where most people don't see 50. The radiation's caught up with me, got maybe a year left, the doctors say, less if I'm unlucky. I've hidden copies of my recordings in locations across the Caribbean, in old Vault-Tec facilities, in alliance settlements, in places I hope will survive whatever comes next. If you're hearing this, you found one of those copies. That means you were looking. That means something about this story called to you. Maybe you recognize the patterns I've described. Maybe you're seeing the same dynamics play out in your own time and place. Maybe you're wondering if resistance is possible, if change is achievable, if the empires of your era can fall like the island vault settlements fell. I can't answer those questions for you. Every situation is different. Every empire has its own vulnerabilities. Every resistance faces its own challenges. But I can tell you what I learned from watching the rise and fall of the Caribbean Coalition's successor states. First, empires built on exploitation are inherently unstable. They require constant enforcement, constant violence, constant pressure to maintain their hierarchies. The moment that pressure falters, the moment people stop being afraid or stop believing the lies, the whole structure starts collapsing. The vault settlements looked invincible until suddenly they weren't. Second, resistance doesn't require matching your oppressor's strength. The Wastelander communities never had better weapons than Nueva Paraíso, never had more resources than Merchant's Haven, never had more soldiers than Port Blackwater. What they had was numbers, determination, and the realization that they didn't need what the vault settlements were selling. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is just refusing to participate in your own exploitation. Third, ideology is more dangerous than weapons. The fusion reactors and fabrication facilities and automated defenses didn't destroy the Caribbean. The belief that some humans were worth more than others, that was the real weapon of mass destruction. That belief created the island vaults, created the exploitation, created the suffering, and that belief survived even after the physical infrastructure collapsed. It's still out there, still spreading, still finding new hosts in every generation. Fourth, liberation is a process, not an event. The fall of the vault settlements didn't create paradise. The Alliance still struggles, still faces internal conflicts, still has people trying to accumulate power and privilege. Freedom isn't something you win and then keep forever. It's something you have to choose every day, something every generation has to fight for in their own way. And fifth, the most important lesson: documentation matters, memory matters, history matters. The industrialists who built the island vaults wanted to be forgotten, wanted their crimes erased, wanted to present themselves as saviors rather than exploiters. If no one remembered what really happened, if no one kept records, if no one testified, they might have succeeded. Their descendants might have rewritten history to make themselves heroes. That's why I've spent 25 years making these recordings, why I've hidden them in locations across the Caribbean, why I'm using my last months of life to make sure this testimony survives. Someone needs to remember. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to have evidence when the powerful try to pretend they earned their position through merit rather than inherited it through theft. The Caribbean island vaults were built with $250 million of pre-war money, money that could have saved thousands of lives if spent differently, could have built public infrastructure, could have funded medical research, could have helped communities prepare for the coming disaster. Instead, it bought luxury bunkers for 7 industrialists and their chosen few. Those industrialists are all dead now. Their empires have fallen. But the pattern continues. Somewhere in the wasteland, someone is accumulating resources. Someone is building their own private paradise. Someone is deciding who deserves to survive and who deserves to die. The names change. The locations change, but the dynamic remains. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you liked the video. I've told you about the island vaults, about their construction and their collapse, about the empires they spawned and the resistance that destroyed them, about Rosa Martinez and Isabella Vega and Marcus Caldwell and all the others who shaped the post-war Caribbean. I've given you the truth as I witnessed it, the uncomfortable, bloody, complicated truth. What you do with that truth is up to you. Maybe you're just listening to an old man's ramblings. Maybe this is ancient history that has no relevance to your life. Or maybe you recognize something in these patterns. Maybe you see the same dynamics playing out around you. Maybe you're wondering if things could be different. I can't tell you what to do, can't tell you how to fight your battles or build your communities, but I can tell you that change is possible, that empires fall, that people can choose cooperation over domination. The Wastelander communities of the Caribbean proved that. They weren't special, weren't superhuman. They were just desperate people who decided they'd rather die free than live as slaves. My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm 73 years old. I helped build the Caribbean island vaults that became fortresses for the pre-war elite. I watched those vaults spawn empires of exploitation, and I watched those empires fall when people refused to accept their bondage. This is my testimony, my confession, my warning, and my hope. The Caribbean vaults are gone now. Most of them are tombs, empty monuments to pre-war greed and post-war cruelty. But in one vault, the one on Isla Sangre, the Alliance has built something different. They've turned Echo into a museum, a place where people can see the luxury the industrialists enjoyed while the world burned, a reminder of what not to recreate. I visited that museum last year, walked through the command center where Victor Blackwood planned his empire, stood in the fabrication facility where Nueva Paraíso's technology was once hoarded, read the inscriptions the Alliance had added, names of the fallen, stories of the resistance, documentation of crimes and testimony of survivors. At the entrance, there's a plaque. It reads, "These vaults were built so the wealthy could escape the consequences of their choices. They failed. We remember them not as monuments to survival, but as warnings against the belief that some lives matter more than others. We are all wastelanders. We survive together or we die alone." That's the real lesson of the Caribbean island vaults. The lesson the industrialists never learned. The lesson their descendants keep forgetting. We survive together or we die alone. There is no private paradise. No luxury bunker isolated from the suffering of the world. No amount of money or power or technology can save you if you're willing to let everyone else burn. The bombs fell. The world ended. Millions died. But humanity survived. Not because the wealthy built their island vaults, not because the powerful hoarded resources, not because the elite positioned themselves to rule. Humanity survived because desperate people in impossible circumstances chose to help each other, chose cooperation over competition, chose community over isolation. That's what the island vaults teach us, not the lesson their builders intended, but the lesson their collapse revealed. Power concentrates naturally. Exploitation requires constant work. Freedom requires constant vigilance, and the choice between building empires or building communities is a choice every generation faces anew. I've made my choice, spent my life documenting the truth, trying to ensure the crimes of the past are remembered so they're not repeated in the future. Now I'm at the end. Time's running out. This is probably the last recording I'll make. To whoever finds this, whoever hears my voice decades or centuries from now, thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for believing that the testimony of one old maintenance technician matters. Maybe my recordings will help you. Maybe they'll just be curiosities. Either way, I've done what I could. The Caribbean island vaults were private bunkers for the pre-war elite. They spawned empires of exploitation that ruled the wasteland for decades. Those empires fell when people refused to be ruled. That's the story. That's the truth. That's my confession. Remember it, learn from it, and when you face your own choice between empire and community, between domination and cooperation, between treating others as resources or as equals, remember that empires fall. Always, eventually. The only question is how much suffering they cause before they do. The holotape is almost full. My time is almost gone. I have nothing left to say except this. The world ended once. It can end again, or we can build something better, something worth surviving for, something that doesn't require fortresses and armies and exploitation to sustain itself. The choice is yours. It always has been. The island vaults were built on the lie that some people deserve paradise, while others deserve ashes. Don't believe that lie. Don't repeat that mistake. Build something better for everyone, together. This is Marcus Thorne, signing off. Good luck out there in the wasteland. And remember, we survive together or we die alone.